This recording is protected by copyright. No part may be reproduced without the prior permission of the University of South Australia.
Now it is my great pleasure to introduce Jill Adams. Jill is a PhD candidate at Central Queensland University. Her research uses oral histories, women's magazines, food writing and cookbooks from the post-war period in Australia to inform her investigation of the housewife. Jill worked at William Angliss Institute for 10 years, where she was manager of the Coffee Academy. She studied at Cordon Bleu in Paris in the 1970s and has a master's in oral history and historical memory. She has also listed a few of her publications, but I know we're getting ready to get started, so it's lovely. So I introduce Jill. Thank you.
And thank you, Ken. That's a fairly hard act to follow, but I would like to segue into it by saying that through one of my cookbook finds, I've actually been able to re-examine the start of television in Australia and give it quite a feminine, gendered story rather than the traditional Bruce Gyngell start of TV popular history that we all have. And I will refer to that, but I'm not going to talk about that at this conference. I was going to start with an anecdote from Paul Thompson, but I decided in the spirit of the she said, he said, that I'd actually start with a personal story. And it does relate to the work that I've been doing. For my mother's 80th birthday last year, my two sisters and I and our children decided that we would produce a cookbook for her. So to do this process, we all gathered our favourite recipes that Mum cooked, that she'd shown us how to cook over our life. We wrote them all out, and we wrote a little personal memory that went with the particular recipes that we chose. We then got Mum to dig out the recipes. I metricised them all and standardised them all. I have the family collection of slides at my house. So I went through and I collected lots and lots of slides of family occasions and picnics and holidays, and all with a little bit of sort of food in them. And then we uploaded everything onto a print-on-demand website called Blurb and produced a beautiful little book of recipes and memories. And I talked to my mum. She wouldn't let me interview her, but I talked to her and I asked her about her cooking. And on her 80th birthday, every member of the family got a hard copy cookbook called Family Favourites. And Mum was absolutely thrilled. But my dad got up and gave a speech at her party. And I learned some really important things just from listening to him. As oral historians do, you learn to kind of listen more carefully to the nuances of what people are saying. First of all, my dad said that when he and my mother got married, Mum had been earning more money than him. She'd been a secretary in Geelong and he'd been an apprentice printer, and she'd been earning a substantially more high wage. But she said to him, "Bruce, I don't want to keep working. I want to be a good wife and a mother. So I don't want to work anymore. That's my wish." And my dad supported that, but I realised from that my mum actually had some agency and some choice in whether she worked or not, and that my dad was there supporting her wishes. The other thing that I realised when we looked through the book was that it actually contained a lovely chronology of our family life through the recipes and through the foods that Mum cooked, right through from the 50s through to her latest dishes that she was always experimenting with. So there was this little history of our family with the memories and the photos and the recipes. And I also realised that my father, by thanking us for producing this book, was actually saying to us in a very subtle way, thank you for acknowledging your mother's life through her cooking. 3 professional daughters, lots of professional granddaughters, this women all doing completely different roles. Here we were, but we acknowledged my mother as her domestic life through producing a cookbook to celebrate this big event. And I realised that my dad was actually just sort of saying, thanks for that, we appreciate that. So with that, my work is about using food and cooking to kind of re-look at the 1950s housewife and the image that we've been given of her through our popular culture. So I'm going to go back to my paper now because my personal story is finished, and I will talk about Paul Thompson because he argues that the most striking use of oral history is in exploring the history of the family. And whilst this paper is not about family, it does seek to reassess the way collective memory would have us understand the life of its custodian, the housewife. The study of food has emerged as a serious academic pursuit in the last 10 or 15 years, and cookbooks, especially those that contain marginalia, which are the splodges, the accidental spills, the torn pages, the inserts, the slips of paper that go in, they're the ones that are regarded as the most valuable. Using oral histories to add women's stories to the cookbooks that they used gives these cookbooks even greater agency in telling us what was going on domestically in the 1950s. For me, though, the joy of collecting women's stories about the food that they cooked is that their narratives are tinged with flavours and tastes and textures, and every recipe tells a story about a person, a place and a time. And for this reason, it's really hard to actually do a formal oral history. They're more conversations, and you'll hear that in the recordings that I've got up here. So this paper is using I've gone Mac, so I'm really hopeless at using the mouse. So I don't know whether I can just push it through.
You should just be able to.
There we go. Okay. So you have to stay there and show me what you did. I wasn't watching. So this paper is using cookbooks and oral histories to challenge 4 dominant strands in our popular memory about women's lives in the post-war period. Firstly, that women dressed in pretty waist-cinching dresses and made cupcakes. Secondly, that women were unhappy with their domestic lives and that cooking was all about drudgery. Thirdly, that Australian women cooked from a very Anglo-Australian heritage and that our food was dull, boring and bland. And the other thing that I've been exploring in my PhD is American influences on our food and culture in the post-war period. Often ignored, it's there and it's really strongly there, but it's often ignored for a more culturally correct influence of post-war migration and the foods and culture that we got from Europe in the post-war period. It seems to be a nicer story to tell than the kind of boxed, packaged instant foods that came out of America. In terms of cupcakes, American historian Lynn Spiegel argues that television serves as one of our generation's primary sources of historical consciousness, and it's caused women to have a very skewed sense of their past. In Australia, we actually have reruns of American situation comedies produced in the 1950s, showing very traditional versions of the family and the role of the housewife. We also have current period reconstructions of periods through our television shows. We recently had The Midwife, which was a reconstruction of Britain in the post-war period. We've had Mad Men, the 60s in America, and we've got some Australian offerings too. A Place to Call Home was probably the most recent one that I could think of. And it's largely through these programs and their reconstructed past that we understand the 1950s. In some cases, they even influence the way we behave. Melbourne writer Helen Garner wrote how she ironed the pillowcases in the spirit of Betty Draper after watching an episode of Mad Men. Now, this one. That's it. Okay. We see here that the 1950s in a very sort of wistfully, slightly comic lens, and this is really common in our advertising, in our magazines. This shows the housewife. She's beautifully done up. She's very calm. She's very blissful. She's very pink. And she's used a lot in this way in television, film advertising and marketing. It's so pervasive that it's become imposed on our collective memory of the era. The other thing that we see, that feminist writing from the 1970s and the 1980s often portrayed women's domestic role as a very unhappy one. Betty Friedan, for example, argued that women groomed to be perfect wives and housewives were deeply unhappy. Your very own Jean Duras from Adelaide traces examples of food memories in the 1950s and the 1960s Australia as a starting point to address the later myth-making of the era. In our food culture, an enduring story describes the bland, dull, Anglo-English foods that we consumed in the post-war period. And a lot of this comes to us from second-generation migrants who have set up very successful businesses. And I'm going to quote from Steve Manfredi, who's a very successful Sydney chef. His family came out and were stationed at Bonegilla for a while, and he said, "I couldn't believe it at Bonegilla. We had no idea people ate so badly. It was atrocious. Growing up in Italy, I thought everyone ate like we did. Little did I know we would be confronted with pale pastel-coloured vegetables floating in water, overcooked mutton, grey gravy, strange smelly runny custard and bread that had no texture or body to it whatever." Even our own culinary icon, Margaret Fulton, adds to this very negative remembering of food in the 1950s. In a 2011 interview, she states that she wrote her 1968 cookbook, quote, because women were bored with their cooking. We associate the 1950s with the worst of our culinary traditions and the best of our culinary remembering. So it's a really mixed up period. We're either deriding the foods cooked or we're looking back with this beautiful nostalgic remembering of cake tins and biscuit tins groaning with home-baked goodies. An analysis of cookbooks published in the post-war period provides very useful information about domestic life, about what women cooked, foods they had access to, fashion, family life, entertaining and new technologies. It also challenges our beliefs about the Anglo-Australian diet. We see surprising ingredients, recipes and cultural influences. And we never see the cupcake, but we do see fairy cakes, patty cakes, butterfly cakes and queen cakes. The cupcake came from Sex and the City, dare I say, and the Magnolia Bakery in New York, which the girls often visited and got their cupcakes from. Interviewing women about how they use their books adds to their value as resources. And I'm going to take you to the first of my books. This is the Hostess Cookbook. This was an early post-war book published in 1952, reprinted 4 times and was written by a woman called Elizabeth Cox, who was also a cook herself. And she noted that she prepared and arranged the food that was illustrated in the book. So that's one of her food preparations, the lobster thermidor there. Cox wrote it for housewives and businesswomen who loved cooking and entertaining but needed assistance coping with the lack of help in houses over the war and women with restricted time. She encouraged the use of labour-saving devices, tinned and prepared foods, and she gave instructions for use of the pressure cooker where appropriate. Cox maintained a presence through all of her recipes. She had a very sort of chatty but very authorial voice. And she was saying things like, you know, quote, "If you have a warming oven, place the meat in it on a serving dish surrounded by the apricots and the bacon roll, then put the souffle in the main oven just before the guests arrive to dinner. This should be about sufficient time to have a chat 2 courses before the souffle is brought triumphantly in." When I found this book, I thought it was really pretentious. I thought the recipes were complicated. I thought it was really silly advice. But then I met Naomi Nicholson. She loved this book and she used it often. Now, I wasn't able to interview Naomi Nicholson. It's a long story. I had a lot of trouble getting ethical clearance to interview housewives about their cooking in the 1950s from my university. It was high risk. Anyway, so I went in and I spoke to Naomi and I took copious notes. She said to me, "I made the lemon delicious out of it only the other day." She liked this book for its dinner party ideas. It was what they did in those days, she said. 10 to 12 people we'd have. She'd do something for a main course and she'd have a cold dessert that was already prepared. She said to me that it showed you how to make simple things and to add something a bit special to them. She said half a pear, you'd canned it, a canned pear, could be filled with jam, then you'd use the white of the eggs, you could make a meringue, put the meringue over the top and bake it, and with the yolks you could make custard. Really what you had with was canned pears and custard, but it was very different. She found this book particularly helpful with a family, 3 children born very close together. You always made a pudding in those days, she said, and it was hard to produce one night after night. This book gave you lots of simple ideas for dressing up simple ingredients that you had on hand for dessert. So, the other book that Naomi had was a book called O for a French Wife, and probably lots of you have seen this book. It was first published in 1952. It was reprinted and republished throughout the 1950s and the 1960s. It was a very, very popular book. It combined slightly risque but eloquent food writing, photography, cartoons by George Molnar, who was a witty and urbane Hungarian whose cartoons graced the pages of the Sydney Morning Herald for many years. It had recipes for French cuisine, light-hearted information about the science behind cooking, and ideas for sophisticated entertaining in a cookbook that took aspirational cooks on a culinary romp. It was based on an American book, though, written by William Irwin Wallace called The Garrulous Gourmet, and it pretty much copies The Garrulous Gourmet in its style. It's a fascinating book, and when it was first published, there were still many food shortages in Australia, and the book notes that it's going to produce substitutes for food shortages. It's clearly aspirational. It's all about French food, but it has many references to American sophistication. And I quote here, "The book would never have been written if it hadn't been for us drinking a martini a few years ago." It meditates on the philosophy of cooking, as did Anthelme Brillat-Savarin, and it suggested recipes for cocktail parties, fork meals, luncheons and dinners, indicating a very strong presence of the gastronome in Australia in the 1950s. And the gastronome came into America in the late 1940s, so very sort of quick transference of this sort of person who understood about Brillat-Savarin and French food in Australia. Naomi Nicholson loved this book. It was given to her as a wedding present. She made the beef stroganoff, potato recipes, potatoes Anna, chicken Maryland, snuck in from America into a French cookbook, and sweet and sour fish. She remembers her parents coming to her tiny flat and she knew they were expecting a roast, so she'd do a very different dish for them. Continental cooking and American celebrity chefs is my next little theme, and this is where Ken and I kind of come, because he's got some collections, so he's got some holdings at the National Film and Sound Archive from this woman that I've been looking at. The belief that the Australian housewives had a repertoire of bland, British-based dishes comes under scrutiny when we examine the books published and available in the post-war period and talk to women who bought or borrowed them and used the recipes. Betty Cumming wasn't interested in using the CWA book. She was quite determined when and I did interview Betty Cumming. For her, cooking was a very creative thing. She married in the early 1960s and she felt it was important to try something different rather than just cook a meal. She was interested in international cooking and used Elizabeth Campbell, Dione Lucas, Simone Beck and the Time Life Cooking of the World series with their beautiful images of food. She planned her dinner parties carefully and she was very critical of what other people served to her when she went to their homes. She said in the 1960s everybody had a variation on cheesecake and everybody used to serve quiche as an entree and then they'd serve up a cheesecake. So I'm going to play a little sound bite from Betty. I have to turn this up, I think. Is it going to work? Sure. It's supposed to work.
To the front section and do it that way.
And would you tell your dinner party guests that you were that they were eating French tonight?
No, I just...
Mary Robbins.
Oh, I made it for the Robins.
Ah,
I see.
Guards pudding.
Because that was his favourite pudding. See by the splatters.
You can see the splats.
I did use it.
That was just to indicate her, her love of entertaining and that kind of real hospitality by making things for people that she loved. Betty Cumming had a foodie pedigree even in the 1950s. Her mother knew Jean Bowring, who wrote food pages for the Herald Sun, and Jean was on TV as well. There were quite a few cooking shows on TV in those days, Betty Cumming told me. When she first saw visiting American celebrity chef Dione Lucas on TV in 1958, she bought her book, the Dione Lucas Gourmet Cooking School Cookbook. Now, Dione Lucas is a person of interest in my PhD. She was a British-born American television celebrity chef, and I came across her through a cookery supplement that I found in the Australian Women's Weekly. She was brought out here 3 times in the 1950s to demonstrate French cordon bleu cooking to Australian housewives. When I dug deeper into the reason for bringing her out here in 1956, it was actually to market television to housewives. And I've done quite a lot of work on that actual period and written quite a different gendered start to Australian TV, with Dione being, I think, the first woman to actually be broadcast on television through her cooking demonstrations. Women flocked to David Jones in Sydney and Myers in Melbourne to see her cooking, and if they couldn't attend her demonstration in the set-up kitchen, they could watch her on one of 45 television sets set up around the store. And then if they saw what they liked on TV, they could go over to the TV and radio exhibition that was just in the next sort of area and put a down payment on the TV. Women had 80% of the household budget, so you had to get them. If you wanted to sell things, you had to get women in, and it was through cooking that happened. And French cordon bleu cooking in the 1950s. So I'm going to skip that little bit, I think, because that's the Dione Lucas Gourmet Cooking School Cookbook. And Betty's talking about using a recipe from it, but I'm actually not going to go there. That's a picture of Dione Lucas and the magazine that I found that kind of led me off on this wonderful little journey of Australian television. Now I've lost where I am on my paper because I've skipped all those things. Okay. Julie Roberts was another person who I interviewed in relation to Dione Lucas. In fact, when I found all these cookbooks and I realised that she'd been demonstrating at David Jones, I put a little article in Epicure in The Age in Melbourne, and I had lots of women get in touch with me because they'd been to her demonstrations in Melbourne, and I wanted to ask them what they had, why they'd gone. I was really curious about this interest in French cordon bleu cooking, why they'd gone, what they got out of it, and what that sort of, how that destroyed the myth of the Anglo-English, boring, dull food. And lots of women got in touch with me in Melbourne and in Queensland to talk about Dione Lucas. Julie Roberts was a Queensland person who got in touch with me, and she'd been very impressed by Dione Lucas's French cordon bleu cooking demonstrations. She'd actually grown up in Adelaide and remembers her mother cooking from a handwritten cookbook. Her mother, she recalled, had always had a hot-baked dessert, but she didn't connect those hot-baked desserts with Britain. It was the technology of the time, she told me, the climate in Adelaide, and very few people had fridges. She said cookbooks were full of hot puddings, and they were more popular than cold because it was impossible to keep a gelatin dessert cold. And I've got, that's the page from Julie Roberts' personal cookbook. Okay, So Jilly told me about the sorts of puddings that her mother cooked, and she told me what they ate for dessert. And this was sort of part of my understanding of the American influence on our food. You know, subtly we were hearing stories about American foods being cooked and American influences. She told me that her mother used to make lemon snow, which was a gelatin-based dessert, which was a special treat. And she also showed me her favourite cookbook, which was called The Flavour of France, written by Narcisse Chamberlain. That's The Flavour of France, written by Narcisse Chamberlain. And this is a little sound excerpt from Jilly, but I'm not... well, I'll see if I... Anyway, I'll play it.
Hamish Hamilton, London. So that was published in 1960 in Great Britain.
Right.
And then, so it printed in the United States of America. Isn't that
Yes.
interesting? You wouldn't. This is a beautiful cookbook. I love it.
This is us just talking about our cookbook. I might just... Okay. So this is the cookbook. Now this is really interesting because this book was written by Narcisse Chamberlain, who was the daughter of Narcissa and Samuel Chamberlain, who were American food writers and travel writers. Samuel Chamberlain wrote for Gourmet magazine. I think he edited it throughout the 1950s, Gourmet magazine in America. Narcisse was an editor for a publisher that specialised in cookbooks, and she was an independent cookbook writer. So this kind of led me to believe that even our French domestic cooking came not through France and Europe, but came to us through this American, slid into Australia via America, which is something that we haven't really acknowledged. Jilly Rogers also entertained a lot and had a huge collection of cookbooks. And she was one of the first women to demonstrate cooking on television, working for the Rice Board and demonstrating recipes for cooking rice, which Australian women didn't cook. In the 1950s, though, she was at Adelaide University and she recycled her university exam booklets and wrote all her recipes in them. When I interviewed her, she was really concerned because she thought she'd lost them, and she was very preoccupied throughout our interview because she couldn't find these books. She kept tottering out to the garage and trying to find them. They were somewhere in her shed, and she hoped that they were still there, but she actually wondered whether she'd thrown them out. And I want to play this because it's a really interesting little...
I wonder if I have. I'm sure I have. University exam. I'm just thinking, have I transformed them? I'm sure I haven't.
Did I throw them out? I don't think so. Did I throw them out? Anyway, she found them, and we were thrilled. Okay. So the other interview that I did was a little bit different. I've done quite a few, but this one that stood out. This was a woman in Queensland who contacted me because she wanted to talk to me about raising a family in far outback Queensland in the 1950s. She'd got married. She was a nurse. She'd married a fellow who lived in Charleville, and she'd moved up to Charleville and lived in really difficult circumstances.
Well, she made this most glorious Victoria sponge in this old wood stove that I had. And it was to die for. We got some cream from somewhere, I don't know where, whipped it up, all by hand. Everything was made. The cake was all made by hand with the old hand beater. And I can't remember what it looked like in the wall. I think it was, unless she beat it. She may have beaten it up by hand. I just can't remember that bit. But anyway, it turned out beautiful. So I found I had a knack for cooking. And from there on, I picked up bits and pieces from other women.
Faye goes on to tell me about the most sumptuous afternoon teas that they had in those days. Everyone was a cook in those days. And even though the work was hard, she said they produced really beautiful things and they used really beautiful ingredients. And she was so proud of how hard she'd worked. That was the thing that actually came across throughout the whole interview, this absolute pride in that life that she'd lived and what she'd done. She also had some public recognition, which a lot of women had in those days, and we forget about the competitions, the magazines that published recipes and gave you a $10 prize for the best and $5 for the second or pounds. There were some fantastic competitions for Aunt Mary's baking powder with prize pools of £250. So there was a lot of recognition of women's work that's kind of gone under the radar. Faye won a couple of prizes at the show, and when she showed me her her cookbook, there was a community cookbook that she'd contributed to, and the first page that she turned to was her recipe for sweet and sour pork that was sitting in that community cookbook. So there's this huge pride, and it's really lovely to be able to be part of that, bringing out of those stories and giving women the agency for what they actually did in the 50s. So in conclusion, by talking to women about what they cooked and how they cooked and the cookbooks they used, one gets a very, very different impression of the post-war period. Firstly, women didn't bake cupcakes. They weren't bored, on the whole, with their cooking, and cooking for many was a very creative pursuit. Our diet wasn't boring and bland and British, but women were interested in international cooking and experimented with new ways of cooking, new foods, new recipes and new ingredients. American and continental foods. They entertained and they spent pleasurable hours planning, cooking and enjoying meals with guests. Some turned what they had access to into delicious meals, and some were publicly acknowledged, winning prizes for recipes. Women were proud of what they cooked, and this is a bit of a generalisation, and it gave them a great deal of pleasure, and it gave other people a great deal of pleasure. And many women actually had very interesting careers in a fledgling television industry that was built on their interest in food and cooking and domesticity.